I received an official-looking letter from the HOA. The envelope was marked with a familiar red seal, and the words "Urgent Notice" stood out in bold black font. I already knew what was coming. Over the years, I had dealt with the HOA on various minor issues, but this time, I had a sinking feeling it was going to be more serious. I opened the letter, and there it was, an official complaint about my organic garden. The HOA claimed that my garden violated the neighborhood's aesthetic guidelines and was unsightly. They argued that the plants were overgrown, the layout was irregular, and that my yard was an eyesore in comparison to the more uniform lawns in the area. They demanded that I remove the garden or face fines. I couldn't believe it. My garden was thriving. I had put so much time and effort into growing organic vegetables, herbs, and flowers, all planted with the goal of creating a sustainable, environmentally friendly space. The plants weren't overgrown. They were healthy and thriving, providing food for my family and supporting pollinators like bees and butterflies. I didn't even have a lawn, opting for a more natural approach. But to the HOA, this meant it was unsightly. As a sustainability expert, I was well aware of the benefits of organic gardening, not just for my own home, but for the environment. My garden reduced water usage, avoided harmful chemicals, and supported local wildlife. I was proud of it, and I couldn't stand the thought of having to tear it down simply because it didn't fit into the narrow, uniform idea of what a proper garden should look like according to the HOA's outdated guidelines. My mind raced as I processed the letter. This wasn't just a fine. This was a direct attack on my rights as a homeowner to maintain my property in a way that aligned with my values. I knew I wasn't the only one who had faced this kind of restriction, but I wasn't about to back down. I stood in my garden, looking over the rows of tomatoes, peppers, and sunflowers, all basking in the morning sun. This garden wasn't just a hobby. It was a statement. It was about sustainability, about reducing my carbon footprint, and about showing my kids that living in harmony with nature was possible. The thought of having to rip it out was not an option. I took a deep breath, feeling the cool breeze on my face. I had been an environmental advocate for years, fighting for policies that supported sustainability and eco-friendly living. Now it was time to put my expertise into action and stand up for my garden, and for my right to make environmentally conscious decisions on my own property. I wasn't about to let this go without a fight. As a sustainability expert, I knew the importance of organic gardening, not only for my family, but for the environment as a whole. I had spent countless hours researching the benefits of using natural, chemical-free methods to grow food. My garden wasn't just a patch of soil. It was an ecosystem, one that promoted biodiversity, helped conserve water, and supported local wildlife. And it was legal. The first thing I did was pull up the HOA's governing documents. I reviewed their aesthetic guidelines carefully, looking for any mention of gardening or landscaping regulations that could apply to me. But, as expected, their rules were vague at best. They had a broad section on maintaining lawns and keeping yards neat and uniform, but nothing specific about organic gardening or what types of plants were permissible. The guidelines made no mention of gardens that didn't fit into a manicured, chemical-laden lawn standard, let alone gardens that encouraged sustainability and environmental responsibility. Next, I turned to local zoning laws. I dug through the municipal codes and found that there were no restrictions on organic gardening within residential properties, and in fact, some local policies even encouraged homeowners to plant sustainable gardens to promote water conservation and reduce carbon footprints. I wasn't just in the clear legally. I was well within my rights to grow my garden as I saw fit, and I had state and local law on my side. After gathering all this information, I knew I had to respond. I wasn't going to let the HOA bully me into taking down something that was not only beneficial to the environment but also protected by local law. I needed to write a letter, a clear and firm response that laid out my case. I spent the next few hours drafting my letter to the HOA. I started by addressing their complaint directly, explaining that my garden was fully compliant with local laws and that the aesthetic guidelines they referenced were far too vague to apply to my property. I explained that organic gardening wasn't just a choice. It was a commitment to sustainability, one that helped reduce water consumption, protected pollinators, and avoided harmful chemicals that could seep into the soil and water supply. My garden was a step toward a more sustainable future, not just for me, but for the entire community. I backed my argument with the research I had done, citing both local ordinances and environmental laws that supported my right to maintain my property in an eco-friendly manner. I included pictures of my garden, showing how it was neatly organized and far from an eyesore. I pointed out that my plants were well tended and provided not only food for my family, but also a safe habitat for local insects and animals. At the end of the letter, I made it clear that I would not remove my garden, and I demanded that the HOA rescind the fine. I requested a formal meeting to discuss the matter further, stating that if they continued to pursue this unfair fine, I would take legal action to protect my rights as a homeowner. After reviewing the letter one last time, I sealed it in an envelope and sent it off to the HOA. I was ready for whatever came next. I knew I was in the right, but I also knew that challenging the HOA wouldn't be easy. But I wasn't afraid of the fight. This wasn't just about my garden. It was about the larger fight for eco-friendly living and sustainable practices. If I could push back against the HOA and win, it could set a precedent for others in the neighborhood and beyond who wanted to make sustainable choices for their homes. Days passed, and the waiting began to wear on me. Every time I checked the mailbox, my heart raced, hoping for a response from the HOA. I had made my case, and now all I could do was wait and see how they would respond to my letter. I couldn't imagine them ignoring it. After all, I had backed my arguments with legal precedent and solid environmental reasoning. Still, I knew the HOA could be stubborn. They had a history of imposing unnecessary restrictions on residents, and they might not back down easily, even in the face of clear legal protections. Finally, the letter arrived. I opened it with a sense of anticipation and a slight anxiety, wondering how they would respond to my points. The letter was typed and signed by the HOA board president, which immediately gave me the impression that this wasn't going to be a simple response. I read it carefully, and as I went through it, I couldn't help but feel a wave of frustration. The HOA acknowledged receiving my letter and the information I had provided. They didn't address any of the legal points I had raised or the specific facts I had cited about the environmental benefits of organic gardening. Instead, they focused on the aesthetic aspect of my garden. They continued to argue that the garden was unsightly and did not conform to the community's standards. They claimed that the HOA's guidelines were in place to maintain property values and that the visual uniformity of the neighborhood was of utmost importance. The letter went on to threaten that if I didn't comply with their demands and remove the garden, further fines would be imposed, potentially escalating to legal action. The tone was dismissive, as though they were not taking my argument seriously at all. I felt a surge of anger. The HOA was clearly ignoring the legitimate legal protections I had referenced and the value my garden brought to the community. They were more concerned with maintaining a cookie-cutter, uniform neighborhood than encouraging sustainability or supporting homeowners' rights. It was frustrating to see that they were unwilling to recognize the environmental benefits of my garden or the fact that I was simply trying to make a positive difference. But I wasn't about to let them have the last word. I took a few deep breaths to calm myself before getting to work on my next response. This time, I was going to take a more direct approach. I wasn't just going to refute their claims. I was going to show them that I wasn't going to back down and that I was prepared to fight for my rights, no matter what. I knew I needed to escalate the matter further. The HOA was playing hardball, and it was clear that they needed to be reminded of the legal limits of their power. So I decided to file a formal complaint with a local zoning authority, citing the state laws that protect homeowners' rights to engage in sustainable practices like organic gardening. I also began looking into the possibility of filing a lawsuit if the HOA continued to issue fines or interfere with my right to maintain my property. This wasn't just about the fine anymore. It was about protecting homeowners from the overreach of HOA boards who use their power to impose unreasonable restrictions on personal choices. I wasn't going to let them trample on my rights, and I was ready to take the next step in the fight. Determined not to back down, I immediately began preparing the next steps. I knew I couldn't let the HOA push me around, and I wasn't about to accept their dismissive response. I had already consulted with some of my colleagues in environmental law, and they agreed that I had a strong case. I had done everything by the book. My garden was sustainable, legal, and beneficial to the environment. The HOA's refusal to acknowledge the legal protections and benefits of organic gardening was unacceptable. The first move was to file a formal complaint with a local zoning authority, as I had mentioned in my earlier correspondence. I carefully drafted the complaint, including all the relevant laws, ordinances, and environmental policies that supported my right to garden organically. I attached the documentation I had gathered about the benefits of organic gardening, highlighting how it contributed to water conservation, improved soil health, and supported local wildlife, all in alignment with the city's sustainability goals. At the same time, I started gathering more support from neighbors who had expressed interest in the benefits of organic gardening but hadn't yet dared to speak out. I reached out to a few of them, explaining my situation and encouraging them to lend their voices to the cause. If enough people in the community came together to advocate for sustainable gardening practices, it would be harder for the HOA to ignore us. Together, we could make a difference. I also contacted a local environmental advocacy group, explaining my situation and asking for their guidance. They had experience with similar cases and were familiar with local zoning laws that protected sustainable gardening practices. They offered to assist me with legal advice and provide resources that would strengthen my case. With their help, I was better prepared to challenge the HOA's authority in court if it came to that. While preparing for the worst, I also made sure to keep things professional and cordial. I wrote another letter to the HOA, informing them that I had filed the formal complaint with the zoning authority and had started gathering support from my neighbors and local environmental groups. I reminded them of the legal protections that supported my right to maintain my organic garden and asked them once again to rescind the fine and halt their opposition to sustainable practices. This time, I made it clear that I was prepared to escalate the matter. If the HOA continued with their unjustified actions, I would be forced to take them to court and seek damages for the emotional distress and harm caused by their interference with my property rights. I was fully prepared to go the distance, and I made sure they understood that. With everything in place, I submitted the formal complaint and sent the letter to the HOA. I took a moment to breathe and reflect on the journey I had just begun. This wasn't just about my garden anymore. This was about ensuring that homeowners everywhere had the right to make decisions about their property that benefited the environment and supported sustainability. It was about challenging the outdated, rigid thinking that often held communities back from embracing a greener, more eco-conscious future. Now, all I could do was wait. But this time, I wasn't worried. I knew I had a solid legal foundation, and I had the community on my side. The fight wasn't over, but I felt more empowered than ever. After sending the formal complaint and letter to the HO, I waited with anticipation. I was hopeful that the HOA would back off, but part of me knew this wasn't going to be easy. The fight wasn't just for my garden anymore. It had grown into a battle for homeowners' rights and the larger movement towards sustainable living. I had made my case clearly, but now it was time to see if the HOA would continue their pursuit or recognize the legal protections I was invoking. In the meantime, the support from my neighbors grew. I had started a group chat with those who had expressed an interest in organic gardening and sustainability. Many of them were now aware of the situation and were eager to lend their support. They started sharing stories about how the HOA had been difficult in the past, and some even admitted they had been reluctant to challenge the board out of fear of retaliation. Together, we brainstormed ways to organize a community meeting. We wanted to show the HOA that this wasn't just about my garden. It was a movement. If we could present a united front, it would send a message that the HOA could no longer ignore. Then, a week after sending my response to the HOA, I got a phone call that I had been waiting for. It was from the local zoning authority. The representative on the other end of the line explained that they had reviewed my formal complaint and were scheduling a hearing to discuss the matter further. They informed me that they had already spoken to the HOA about the issue, but it seemed clear that the HOA was not going to back down without legal intervention. I asked if they could give me more details about the hearing, and they explained that I could attend and present my case. It felt like a win, but I also knew this would be the real test. If the zoning authority was on my side, the HOA's position would be even more difficult to maintain. This hearing could be the turning point. To prepare, I spent hours organizing my arguments. I wanted to show the zoning authority that my garden was not only within legal bounds, but that it was aligned with broader environmental goals that were beneficial to the entire community. I presented the data on water conservation, soil health, and biodiversity that I had researched, and I made sure to outline how my garden was neatly maintained and compliant with all local zoning laws. As the hearing date approached, I continued to rally my neighbors. We organized a small group to attend the hearing, showing support for sustainable practices. Several of them offered to speak on my behalf, explaining how they had been inspired by my efforts and were interested in creating their own organic gardens, but had been hesitant because of the HOA's influence. It was clear that this issue went beyond just my property. It was something that resonated with others who were also seeking to live more sustainably. The night before the hearing, I felt a mix of nerves and determination. I knew this wasn't just about defending my garden. It was about taking a stand for eco-friendly living and setting an example for others in the community. If I could get the zoning authority on our side, it It would not only invalidate the HOA's fine, but also send a powerful message about the importance of supporting sustainability in residential areas. I wasn't just fighting for my garden anymore. I was fighting for every homeowner who wanted to make their property a better, more sustainable place to live. And I was ready to give it my all. The day of the hearing arrived, and I was both nervous and resolute. I had spent hours preparing my case, gathering all the necessary documentation, and rehearsing my arguments. It wasn't just about presenting the facts anymore. It was about conveying the importance of my garden in the broader context of sustainability, community responsibility, and homeowners' rights. This was my moment to show the zoning authority and the HOA that eco-friendly living was no longer a niche interest but a fundamental part of our future. I arrived early, my notes in hand, and was greeted by the sight of a few of my neighbors who had come to show their support. They were standing near the entrance of the hearing room, chatting quietly. Several had volunteered to speak on my behalf, expressing their willingness to share how the HOA's actions had inspired them to take a closer look at sustainable gardening practices themselves. It was encouraging to see their commitment, and I knew that together we had the power to make a difference. When the hearing began, I was called to the front to present my case. I took a deep breath, stood tall, and began by introducing myself and explaining the situation. I walked the zoning authority through the entire process, the HOA's initial complaint, the fine, and my response to their unjust claims. I made sure to stay calm and collected, highlighting the key points of my legal arguments. I reminded them of the local and state laws that supported my right to grow an organic garden, stressing that there were no laws in place that prohibited sustainable gardening in residential areas. Then, I turned to the environmental benefits of my garden. I discussed how organic gardening helped conserve water, promoted biodiversity, and reduced the need for harmful pesticides and fertilizers that could pollute the soil and water systems. I explained that my garden was not just for my family. It was part of a larger movement towards sustainability and environmental stewardship that could inspire the entire neighborhood. After presenting my case, I invited a few of my neighbors to speak. One by one, they stood up and shared their support, each telling the zoning authority how they had been hesitant to start their own gardens because of the fear of HOA retaliation. They spoke about how my garden had inspired them to consider more eco-friendly living options and how they believed the HOA's approach was outdated and out of touch with current environmental needs. The zoning authority listened attentively. There were a few questions, but overall, the hearing felt like a step in the right direction. I could see that the members of the board were taking our concerns seriously. They understood that this issue wasn't just about my garden. It was about the broader conversation on sustainability and homeowners' rights in an increasingly eco-conscious world. As the hearing came to an end, the zoning authority announced that they would take time to review the case and issue a decision in the coming weeks. But the tone of the hearing had been positive. It was clear that they recognized the validity of my arguments, and there was a palpable sense of support for my right to maintain an organic garden. The fight wasn't over yet, but I felt more confident than ever. I had stood up for what was right, and I knew I had the community behind me. No matter what the zoning authority decided, I was ready to continue the fight for my garden, for sustainability, and for homeowners' rights. Weeks passed since the hearing, and during that time, I tried to stay calm and patient. But every day, I felt the pressure building. The waiting was the hardest part. While I continued to tend to my garden, making sure everything was thriving and healthy, I couldn't shake the feeling that the final decision could tip either way. It wasn't just about the garden anymore. It was about my right as a homeowner to live sustainably and make eco-conscious decisions for my family's future. I kept in touch with my neighbors who had shown support at the hearing, and they assured me they were still ready to stand by me no matter what the outcome. The community's solidarity made me feel less isolated. They were with me every step of the way, which gave me the strength to continue fighting. Finally, the day I had been waiting for arrived. I received a letter from the zoning authority with a final decision. My heart raced as I opened it, and I read through the formal language carefully. The decision was in my favor. The zoning authority ruled that the HOA's fine was unjustified and that my organic garden was not in violation of any local regulations. They emphasized that while HOAs had the right to enforce aesthetic standards, those standards couldn't override state and local laws that protected homeowners' rights to engage in sustainable practices. The zoning authority even cited several legal precedents in their ruling, reinforcing the idea that eco-friendly living and organic gardening were to be encouraged, not penalized. The HOA was required to rescind the fine immediately, and revised their guidelines to ensure they didn't interfere with homeowners who chose to engage in environmentally responsible practices. In addition, the authority recommended that the HOA hold a community meeting to discuss how they could support sustainable practices in the neighborhood moving forward. Reading the letter brought a flood of relief and joy. This wasn't just a personal victory. It was a victory for every homeowner who felt they had to conform to outdated, restrictive rules that limited their ability to live sustainably. The decision set a precedent that would help others in the future who face similar challenges. It was an affirmation that eco-friendly living could be a part of modern communities without being stifled by unnecessary regulations. I immediately called my neighbors to share the news, and we all celebrated the victory together. It felt incredible to know that not only had I protected my garden, but I had also opened a door for others to pursue their own sustainable living goals without fear of HOA retaliation. But the work wasn't done yet. The HOA had to revise its guidelines, and I was determined to ensure they didn't just passively accept the zoning authority's decision. I reached out to the zoning board and local environmental groups, suggesting we work together to help the HOA understand the broader benefits of sustainability. If they were going to update their guidelines, I wanted them to include clear, positive support for eco-friendly practices, things like rainwater harvesting, organic gardening, and energy-efficient home improvements. After receiving the zoning authority's decision, I knew that while the legal battle was won, the real work had just begun. The victory was a huge step, but I didn't want this to be a one-off success. I wanted to ensure that the HOA's new guidelines would embrace sustainable practices, creating a lasting, positive change for the entire community. I wasn't about to let this opportunity slip through the cracks. I began reaching out to local environmental groups, HOA advocacy organizations, and even sustainable living experts. I wanted to form a coalition that could work with the HOA to help them understand how incorporating eco-friendly guidelines could not only benefit the environment but also increase property values and improve quality of life for homeowners. I knew the HOA board needed education, and if they understood how these practices could align with their goals of maintaining property values, they'd be more likely to make changes. At the same time, I started drafting a proposal that would offer a detailed plan for integrating sustainable living practices into the community. I focused on the benefits of organic gardening, rainwater harvesting, solar energy, and energy-efficient home improvements. I made sure to include examples from other neighborhoods that had successfully implemented such practices without compromising property values or community harmony. The proposal outlined practical steps for homeowners to adopt these practices, such as resources for getting started, potential financial incentives, and ways to ensure that aesthetics were still maintained in the process. I scheduled a meeting with the HOA board, armed with my research proposal and a clear vision of how to move forward. The meeting was set for the following week, and I spent every free moment preparing. I knew I needed to approach this as a collaborative effort rather than a confrontation. The key was to show the board that supporting sustainable practices didn't have to be an either/or situation. It wasn't about tearing down old traditions. It was about building a future where the neighborhood could thrive, both environmentally and economically. The day of the meeting, I walked into the HOA's community center with my proposal in hand, ready to present the case for eco-friendly living. I could tell from the start that the board members were still a little hesitant. Some had crossed their arms, others looked skeptical. But I wasn't about to be deterred. I started by acknowledging the HOA's role in maintaining the neighborhood and ensuring its aesthetic value. Then I seamlessly transitioned into discussing how the world was changing and how sustainability was becoming a critical part of modern living. I pointed out that more and more people were looking for homes that offered energy-efficient features, green spaces, and eco-friendly amenities. I used concrete examples from other neighborhoods that had successfully implemented green practices, showing how it not only enhanced the environment but also improved the financial standing of those communities. I explained that sustainable gardens, solar panels, and water conservation systems were all ways homeowners could increase the value of their property, reduce the utility bills, and contribute to a healthier, greener world. I also highlighted how the HOA could incorporate guidelines for these eco-friendly changes, ensuring that they were implemented in ways that maintained the overall aesthetic of the neighborhood. As I spoke, I could see the board members slowly starting to warm up. A few nodded in agreement, and one of the members even asked for more details about how rainwater harvesting could be done without affecting the visual appeal of the property. By the end of the meeting, the board president thanked me for my thoughtful approach and promised that the HOA would review my proposal thoroughly. He even expressed interest in inviting local sustainability experts to give a presentation at the next community meeting. I left the meeting feeling hopeful, but also aware that the real challenge was just beginning. It would take time to get the HOA board to fully embrace these changes, but I had opened the door. And with the support of my neighbors and the local environmental groups, I knew we had a chance to make a real difference in the community. The weeks following the meeting with the HOA were filled with anticipation. I kept in regular contact with the board president, who had agreed to review my proposal and gather input from other board members. At the same time, I continued to work with my neighbors and the local environmental groups, organizing another community meeting where we could further discuss the potential for sustainable practices in our neighborhood. I wanted to keep up the momentum and ensure that the HOA felt supported by the community as they considered these changes. Finally, the day of the next HOA meeting arrived. The board had decided to invite a local sustainability expert to present at the meeting, as they had promised, and I had been asked to give a brief overview of the proposal I had submitted. As I walked into the meeting, I was met with a different atmosphere. There was an openness in the air, a willingness to listen that hadn't been there the last time. It seemed that the board was taking this seriously now, and that made me feel optimistic about the potential for change. The sustainability expert arrived with a stack of research and case studies, showing how other communities had successfully implemented green initiatives without compromising aesthetic value. He explained how organic gardens, energy-efficient homes, and water conservation systems were becoming increasingly popular among homebuyers and how these eco-friendly practices were positively impacting property values. His presentation was professional and convincing, and it was clear that he had done his homework. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up and addressed the board and my neighbors with a sense of purpose. I thanked the board for their willingness to listen and explained how important this moment was, not just for me, but for the entire community. I emphasized that this was about creating a neighborhood where everyone could thrive, where sustainability wasn't seen as a burden, but as an opportunity. I spoke about the benefits of organic gardening, rainwater harvesting, and energy-efficient systems, and how these practices could be implemented while still maintaining the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood. I also shared personal stories about how my garden had transformed not just my property, but my sense of community. The garden had become a conversation starter, an example for others to see what could be achieved with a little effort and commitment to sustainability. I encouraged the board to look beyond the immediate resistance and consider the long-term benefits, not just in terms of property values, but in fostering a healthier, more connected community. After I finished speaking, the room fell into a moment of silence. But this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes before a breakthrough. Finally, the board president spoke, saying that they were impressed with the presentation and the overwhelming support from the community. He acknowledged that the HOA's original stance had been too rigid and that the landscape of our neighborhood needed to change to reflect the evolving attitudes around sustainability. He then announced that the board had decided to form a committee dedicated to revising the HOA's guidelines to include sustainable practices. They would work on integrating green initiatives into the community's framework, from organic gardens to solar panel installations, rainwater harvesting systems, and energy-efficient landscaping. The president also added that the committee would be open to input from homeowners like me and other community members, ensuring that the revised guidelines were both practical and reflective of the neighborhood's values. The room erupted in applause. The feeling of relief and accomplishment was overwhelming. I had been part of a movement that would change the community for the better, ensuring that future homeowners could live more sustainably without fear of retaliation from the HOA. It was a victory not just for me, but for everyone who wanted to live in a more eco-conscious way. In the following weeks, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted. The HOA's newly formed committee, made up of both board members and a few community volunteers, began meeting regularly to revise the neighborhood guidelines. As promised, they invited feedback from residents, and I was invited to participate in the discussions. This was the moment I had worked toward, the chance to influence the HOA's direction and ensure that sustainable practices would be not only accepted but encouraged moving forward. I attended the first committee meeting with excitement and a sense of responsibility. I knew that this was an opportunity to help others in the community who had been hesitant to start their own gardens or make eco-friendly changes to their homes. The committee members seemed genuinely engaged, and the sustainability expert who had presented at the HOA meeting was also brought in to advise on how to integrate green initiatives without compromising the community's overall appearance. During the meeting, we discussed various sustainable practices, from organic gardening and composting to solar panel installations and energy-efficient landscaping. The committee was particularly interested in how to balance aesthetic concerns with environmental benefits. I shared my experiences with my organic garden, explaining how it added value to my home and the community without detracting from the overall look of the neighborhood. I showed them how a well-maintained organic garden could blend seamlessly into the landscape while reducing water usage and promoting local wildlife. One of the committee members raised concerns about the visual impact of rainwater harvesting systems, but I was prepared. I presented examples of how other communities had successfully integrated rainwater barrels into their landscaping, discreetly placed and often camouflaged with plants or fencing to keep them out of sight. I emphasized that these systems were not only environmentally friendly, but also help homeowners save money by reducing their water bills. As the discussion continued, it became clear that the committee members were beginning to see the value in adopting more sustainable guidelines. They asked questions about the long-term benefits of solar panels and how to encourage homeowners to install them. I explained the financial incentives available for solar energy installations, such as tax credits and rebates, and highlighted how these systems could increase property values in the long run. At the end of the meeting, committee members agreed to put together a draft of the revised guidelines, incorporating many of the suggestions we had discussed. They promised to circulate the draft for community feedback before finalizing it, ensuring that all residents had a say in how the neighborhood would evolve. I felt a great sense of accomplishment. It was clear that the HOA was beginning to embrace a more modern, forward-thinking approach to community living. When the draft of the revised guidelines was distributed, I was thrilled to see that the committee had included many of the eco-friendly initiatives I had championed, including guidelines for organic gardens, rainwater harvesting systems, solar panel installations, and water-efficient landscaping. The guidelines were carefully crafted to ensure that homeowners could make these improvements while still maintaining the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood. The final step was a community vote. I knew that the proposal would likely pass. There had been so much support for sustainability in the neighborhood, but I still felt a sense of nervous anticipation as the vote was held. When the results were announced, the revisions passed with overwhelming support from the residents. The HOA board officially adopted the new guidelines, and it was clear that the neighborhood was now on a path toward sustainability.